innocent people confess all the time. The way that this works is that by the time a suspect is put in an interrogation room, they're actually presumed guilty. What the police typically do, there's a couple of things that they are allowed to do that I think the typical citizen doesn't know. They're allowed to bluff about evidence.
There's people saying you did. Your buddies are saying you fucking did. We got independent witnesses.
I didn't do it.
You fired that 4th shot, brother. We can prove it.
There was only 3 shots.
No, there's 4.
There's 4.
There's 4, bro.
I will not allow you to talk and give your denials. I'll cut you off a lot. I'll probably talk about 90% of the time and not let you speak until you're ready to say that it was you. And then those bluffs, I can say stuff like, we have you on videotape, or we have 5 witnesses who say it was you. You've been identified. Your fingerprints have been, identified by the forensic lab.
We're going to process that gun, and you know what it's going to tell us? Your prints are on that gun. Now, when
and you weren't there, right? So your thought might be, what do you mean you have me on videotape? What do you mean those are my fingerprints? But even as a rational person, you recognize that if the forensic lab thinks it's you, and if I think it's you, and if anyone looking at the videotape would mistake that person as you, you may not want to take a chance in front of a jury.
We know you did it. You know you did it.
And everyone in the house says that too?
What do you think?
Well, we want to hear from you so we can document it. You don't have to tell us because we don't know.
It's okay, man. We already know.
This is an absolute your worst possible nightmare. But still, as a rational, logical person, you might start thinking about cutting your losses. These things are designed to make you feel hopeless. And if they don't from the beginning, you'll get worn down over time. Interrogations can go for many hours. You can be sleep deprived and hungry and need to go to the bathroom and just feel isolated and overpowered, even though no one's hitting you or restraining you or anything. Psychologically, they're very high pressure circumstances. And beyond that, many people who find themselves in interrogation rooms are children, addicts, people of low intelligence, people who have mental illness or emotional disturbance where, that pressure that would normally get to any of us really takes a toll on them to the point where they find themselves willing to sort of, it's so impossible to sit here and imagine being in this state, but they get to the point of being willing to sort of do anything, including signing this paper and getting it over with so they can get out of the room and go home. Sometimes not realizing what the aftermath is going to mean for them. They're never going to go home. And sometimes trusting that this will all get fixed later on because clearly they're innocent, where they don't realize how these gears can start grinding and just crush them. Later, if you're astoundingly lucky, you may be exonerated after you've been convicted. Who knows how many decades you may have spent in prison, but maybe, as it turns out, there's DNA evidence available, and it was tested, and they found the right guy, and it's not you. And when we look at DNA exoneration cases, about a quarter of them involved coerced or false confession. People who we now know are innocent having said, I committed this, typically rape or murder or both. And I think where the problem lies is the police and judges and jurors and, the citizenry, all of us, have a really hard time imagining that somebody who's innocent could also be brought to that same action. It just doesn't sound reasonable. But the fact is, it's not hard under those circumstances to produce an innocent, coerced confession. So, yeah, it's professional people who just, in the end, don't really get it. And you can't blame them. This is just too weird of a phenomenon. I think probably these days the most famous case of a potentially coerced confession is Brendan Dassey, the young man in Making a Murderer.
Be honest. You went back in that room. Don't let us down, Brendan. We know you were back there.
His case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it got to the point where the judges of the Supreme Court decided whether or not to take the case. About 1% of cases get actually taken. And people in my field were so excited that finally the world can learn about this at the scale that it needs to, and we can put protections in place.
How do you know what she said?
I made it up.
You made it up.
Yeah.
And, as this thing battled its way up the levels of the court system, you could see over and over again that justices didn't get it. And when it made it to the level of the Supreme Court making a decision about whether to hear the case, they rejected it. So, what we in my field recognize is that it's not just a matter of educating the police and then, once the damage is done, trying to educate the judges and jurors. We have to make sure that people know about this at all levels, including the highest levels where law is made and interpreted. There is a company that has trained more police officers in interrogation than any other company. It's sort of considered the standard for how to conduct an interrogation. And that company, John Reed and Associates, is now marketing to school administrators. They are training school administrators to interrogate children. And it's horrifying. Partly because their techniques, when investigated, have demonstrated that, yes, confessions increase, but that's because false confessions increase. And some of the methods that Reed trains people in are just simply not reliable. So, for example, deception detection. I don't know if the person looks up into the something, right or left. I can't remember what the folklore is. They're not telling the truth. If they do a lot of eye contact and they don't break eye contact, they're lying. If they avoid eye contact, they're lying. If they're fidgeting or slouching or pointing their feet in the direction of the door, whatever, the theory du jour is, these things are not indicative of lying or truth-telling. And if you ask people, here are several videos, some of them are people telling the truth, some of them are people lying. You tell me which is which. Over and over again, you get an average correct rate of 54% or thereabouts, which is that much more than flipping a coin. People are awful at this. And what Reed and Associates does is train detectives to use whatever ridiculous, tells du jour there are, and to make those officers be very highly confident in themselves.
Where we're going to give the subject basically a good and a bad reason for committing the crime. This is the question we're going to ask that gets us the first admission of guilt.
On the one hand, they don't understand the vulnerability of memory. And on the other hand, they also don't understand how easily they can manipulate somebody else's memory without meaning to. So, classic experiment by this person I mentioned a couple minutes ago, Beth Loftus, in the 1970s. She showed people a scene where two cars get in an accident. And then she asked people who are basically eyewitnesses, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And there's a word there being used. You got to use words to ask the question, but the word smashed led people to increase their speed estimates over somebody else who got a sort of a less violent verb. And the people who got smashed now remember broken glass at the scene, which wasn't there in the original. So, what we learned from that really starkly as psychologists is that memory is extremely easy to push around. You don't have to get up in someone's face and sort of make some strong claim about what happened. You just need to ask a question. And that's not something that I think a typical officer understands.
The Central Park 5 is a very interesting case. 5 young men were accused by police officers of committing a horrendous crime, a rape. None of them did it, but they all confessed to it. You have to ask yourself why. What were the psychological circumstances brought to bear on these juveniles to do that?
You know, what I believe now is what I've believed all along, that people sincerely want our criminal justice system to work. People in all of the different roles, witnesses and officers and, you know, people in the court system are sincere and professional and honest. And this happens despite all that, because our criminal justice system is just founded on a foundation of humanity, warts and all. So what I'd really love to do is find ways to create procedures and policies where across the board we're protecting people, educate judges, juries, police officers, everyone, you know, who contributes to the criminal justice system, and make sure, for example, that videotape is happening during eyewitness interviews, during identification procedures, during interrogations, to be sure that we're in a position to identify influences on witnesses and suspects, so that we can, you know, if there is any form of tainting or influencing, we have some chance of being able to identify that. I talk about these issues in one way or another in every one of my classes. And then how I go beyond the classroom is that, so we study some of these issues in my lab, and I also consult in the criminal justice system. I testify in court cases. I've written reports for post-conviction cases. Maybe someone's been in prison for 30 years and now there are attorneys who are working on relitigating their case and potentially having them exonerated. I've been involved in several of those cases as well. And the more I got acquainted with the criminal justice system, the more I saw the flaws there related to psychology and other kinds of sort of procedural and organizational flaws where someone like me could help. And I found out that, I don't know why it was that I assumed there was a very large body of people with my training who were already helping in the courts, but I found the sort of sobering news that there aren't very many. And so there's a huge need for jurors to be educated about some of these issues. I guess there's 2 lessons that I can impart. One is that no matter who you are, there's good odds that at some point you're going to serve on a jury, and these issues may come to bear on the case that you're making a decision about. And I love to think that there's going to be people who are thoughtful and educated about this, deciding on someone's fate. And I think the bigger lesson that I got out of, you know, this journey is that you don't always know what you can do with the training that you have until those opportunities come to you, or, you know, if you're so inclined, you make those opportunities. I trained to be a scientist in a lab who taught classes, and what I'm finding is that I can take this very unique, rare training that I have and make the world a better place in ways that I hadn't expected when I chose to be a psych major. And that's really inspiring to me, that, you know, any of us could redefine our purpose in profound ways. We're not locked in when we choose a path. We actually are allowing additional possibilities that may not all be obvious when we start down that path.